You don't belong here." The words came cold and flat, cutting through the late afternoon air as Marcus Reed tightened his grip on the small paper bag in his hands, the thin grease stains already soaking through from the half-eaten sandwich inside. His fingers stiff from hours in the wind that swept down the glass canyon of the city street, carrying the smell of exhaust, roasted nuts from a nearby cart, and the faint metallic chill of coming rain. And still he stood there on the edge of the building's polished entrance, where marble floors gleamed just beyond the revolving doors and men in tailored coats moved in and out without ever slowing, without ever looking down, without ever noticing him. Except now they were, just for a second, because Marcus had stepped forward, just a half step, just enough to hold out the bag toward the man sitting near the base of a concrete pillar, a man most people had walked past all day like he was part of the sidewalk itself. His coat too clean to be truly worn, but wrinkled enough to look forgotten, his posture quiet, still, watching everything and nothing at the same time. And Marcus didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, he just crouched slightly, his knees popping softly under the weight of the movement, and extended the food with a small nod, his voice low, steady, almost swallowed by the city noise. "Eat first, you look like you need it." And for a moment the world seemed to slow, the hum of traffic dulling, the revolving door turning in a silent arc behind them, as a few heads turned, not because of kindness but because of disruption, because a man like Marcus wasn't supposed to interrupt the invisible order of things, wasn't supposed to cross that invisible line between the outside and the inside, between the overlooked and the acknowledged. And the man on the ground lifted his eyes, sharp, observant, not confused, not desperate, just measuring, and Marcus held the bag there, arms slightly trembling not from fear, but from hunger he hadn't answered in nearly a day, the last 6 inches of bread he had chosen not to eat, because somewhere along the line he had learned that giving something when you have nothing left meant more than giving when it was easy, meant something deeper, something quieter, something that didn't need witnesses. But witnesses were there now, lingering at the edges, a security guard shifting his stance near the door, a woman pausing mid-step with her phone still in her hand, the air tightening with that subtle tension that comes when something doesn't fit expectations, when a story starts to bend in a way people don't understand. And Marcus didn't pull his hand back, didn't second-guess himself, he just waited, the paper bag rustling softly in the wind, the city breathing around them, and somewhere above, unseen behind tinted glass and steel, the building stood tall and indifferent, its name etched in polished letters that caught the fading sunlight, reflecting it down in fractured gold across the sidewalk where Marcus stood, a man no one knew, offering the only thing he had left to someone the world had already decided not to see. Marcus Reed did not wait for a reaction, not for gratitude, not even for acknowledgment, because he had learned a long time ago that the world did not always respond to quiet kindness, and expecting it only made the cold feel sharper. So when the man's eyes lingered on the paper bag without immediately reaching for it, Marcus simply gave a small nod, the kind that carried no pressure, no demand, and slowly lowered his hand just enough to place the bag beside him on the concrete ledge, careful, almost respectful, as if the simple act of setting it down mattered just as much as the offering itself. And then he stepped back, 1 foot at a time, the worn sole of his sneaker scraping softly against the pavement, his breath visible now in faint white clouds as the temperature dropped another degree, the late afternoon light fading into a dull gray that flattened the glass towers into silhouettes. And behind him the security guard finally moved, not aggressively, but with that firm, practiced stride that said rules mattered more than context, more than intention, more than anything that did not fit the clean lines of the building's image. "You cannot stand here," the guard said, his voice controlled, not loud, but carrying enough weight to turn a few more heads. And Marcus stopped, not startled, just paused, like someone who had heard the same sentence too many times to react to it anymore, his shoulders rising slightly as he took in a slow breath, then lowering again as he turned halfway, his eyes flicking once toward the bag he had left behind, still untouched, still resting there like a quiet question. And for a brief second something moved across his face, not regret, not even disappointment, just a flicker of something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the moment and everything to do with all the moments before it. The nights spent under overpasses where the wind howled through the gaps like it was looking for a way inside your bones. The mornings waking up with the stiffness of concrete still pressed into your back. The constant awareness of how quickly people looked away, how easily you became part of the background, like a shadow that never quite belonged to the light. And yet he never stopped noticing others, never stopped seeing the small signs most people missed. The way someone's hands shook slightly when they had not eaten, the way silence could feel heavier than words, the way loneliness sat in the posture of a person long before it showed in their face. And that was why he had stopped today, why he had chosen to give what little he had, because for Marcus it had never been about having enough. It had always been about not turning away, and now as the guard gestured again, toward the edge of the sidewalk, toward the invisible boundary Marcus was expected to return to, he nodded once, not in defeat, but in quiet understanding, and stepped back fully, retreating into the space where he was allowed to exist, the colder, rougher edge of the street where the polished shine of the building no longer reached, where the wind felt sharper and the air carried the distant hum of sirens blending into the rhythm of the city. And he adjusted the collar of his worn jacket, pulling it closer around his neck, his fingers brushing briefly against the empty pocket where the rest of his meal had been, now gone, now given, and without another word, without looking back again, he turned and began to walk, slow, steady, each step measured not by where he was going, but by the simple fact that he kept moving, while behind him, just beyond the line he had crossed, the man by the pillar remained still, his gaze no longer drifting, but fixed now on the small paper bag resting quietly beside him, as if it held more than just food, as if it carried something he had not expected to find. The man by the pillar did not move for several seconds after Marcus disappeared into the flow of the street, his eyes fixed on the paper bag as if it were something unfamiliar, something out of place in a world that usually ran on transactions and expectations, and slowly, almost deliberately, he reached for it, his fingers brushing the thin, slightly damp surface, feeling the warmth that had not completely faded, a quiet reminder that it had been given recently, not discarded, not forgotten. And as he opened it, the faint scent of bread and simple filling rose into the cooling air, unremarkable to most, but in that moment it carried a weight far beyond its contents, and he paused, his gaze shifting briefly toward the direction Marcus had gone, already swallowed by distance and movement, then back to the food in his hands, and something in his expression changed, not visibly enough for anyone passing by to notice, but enough to settle deeper into his posture, into the stillness that surrounded him, as if a calculation had begun somewhere behind his calm exterior, something measured not in dollars or square footage, but in intention, in instinct, in the rare simplicity of an act that expected nothing in return, and above them, several floors up behind tinted glass, a pair of eyes had already been watching, reviewing the moment not as a passerby would, but as someone who had been observing patterns for weeks, maybe months, a quiet experiment unfolding in plain sight, where hundreds had walked past without hesitation, without pause, without even the smallest acknowledgment, and yet one man had stopped, one man had seen, and now that single deviation lingered like a ripple that refused to disappear, and inside the building, in a room where the air was controlled and the city, noise reduced to a distant hum. A screen replayed the scene in silent clarity, the angle capturing Marcus's approach, the extension of his hand, the subtle shift of his posture as he chose to give rather than walk away. And the man watching leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of a polished desk, the reflection of the footage flickering faintly across its surface, and he did not speak, did not call for anyone, did not interrupt the quiet process, unfolding in his mind, because what he had seen was not dramatic, not extraordinary in the way headlines demanded, but it was precise, undeniable in its sincerity, and that mattered more. And as the footage looped once more, he noted the details most would overlook, the worn condition of Marcus's shoes, the careful way he placed the bag rather than dropping it, the absence of hesitation even when attention turned toward him, and something in that sequence settled into place, aligning with a question he had been asking for a long time, one that money and status had never fully answered. And back outside, the city continued without pause, people moving in steady currents, headlights beginning to flicker on as the daylight thinned, and somewhere along the outer edge of the block, Marcus walked with the same steady rhythm, unaware that his small decision had already been captured, replayed, and now quietly held in the hands of someone who did not forget what he saw, someone who understood that the rarest thing in a city full of millions was not wealth, but a moment like that, given freely, without witness, without reward. And inside the building, the man closed the screen with a soft click, the image fading to black, but the impression it left remained, clear, deliberate, and far from finished. The next morning arrived without ceremony. The sky, a pale gray, stretched thin over the city as if the light itself was hesitant to settle. And inside the building the rhythm resumed with its usual precision, elevators opening and closing in timed intervals, polished shoes crossing marble floors, quiet conversations slipping between glass walls, everything exactly where it was expected to be. Everything controlled, predictable, and far removed from the uneven pulse of the street outside. And yet in one office, high above the noise, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to interrupt the routine, as the man who had watched the footage the night before stood by the window with a stillness that did not match the movement below, his reflection faint against the glass, his gaze not fixed on the skyline, but somewhere deeper, somewhere between memory and decision. And behind him the desk remained untouched, the files unopened, the morning schedule quietly waiting, while his mind replayed not the entire scene, but a single detail. The way Marcus had not looked around before offering the food, had not checked who was watching, had not measured the moment for advantage, and that absence of calculation lingered now like a question that demanded more than observation. And finally he turned, the soft movement breaking the silence as he reached for his phone. His fingers steady, deliberate, dialing a number he rarely used for anything routine. And when the call connected, his voice remained calm, controlled, but carried a weight that shifted the tone of the room even without the other person present. "I want the footage from yesterday morning pulled and archived," he said, pausing just long enough for the instruction to settle. "And I want you to identify the man who approached the subject at the entrance. Every angle, every frame. I do not want assumptions, I want certainty." And there was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that followed unexpected direction, before a quiet acknowledgment came through, and the line ended just as smoothly as it had begun, leaving the room once again in stillness. But now it was a different kind of stillness, one that carried intention, and outside, miles away from that controlled environment, Marcus moved through his morning with the same quiet rhythm he always had, his steps leading him past storefronts just beginning to open, past the familiar corners where faces changed but routines stayed the same, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his jacket for warmth as the early air bit against his skin. And he paused briefly near a coffee shop window, not to go inside but to feel the faint heat escaping each time the door opened, a small comfort measured in seconds, before continuing on, his path shaped not by destination but by habit, by the invisible lines he had learned to follow in a city that rarely made space for him. And he did not know that somewhere behind tinted glass his image was being studied, his presence traced backward through time, through camera feeds and timestamps, through quiet systems designed to track movement and detail. And as the hours passed, pieces began to align, fragments forming a clearer picture, not just of where he had been, but of who he was within the spaces he occupied. And back in the office, the man reviewed the first set of results in silence, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharpened, because what he was seeing was not just confirmation, it was continuity, a pattern of small, consistent actions that carried no recognition, no reward, and yet persisted. And that, more than anything else, was what held his focus, because it meant the moment from yesterday had not been an exception. It had been a reflection of something deeper, something real. And as he set the file down with a soft, controlled motion, the decision that followed did not come with hesitation, only with a quiet certainty that the next step would not be observation, but intervention. By late afternoon, the city had shifted into that restless in-between hour where shadows stretched longer across the sidewalks, and the glass towers reflected a dimmer, colder light. And Marcus found himself drawn back toward the same block without fully deciding to go there, his steps slowing as he approached the familiar stretch of polished stone and quiet authority, the building rising again in front of him like something unchanged, something distant, and yet something about it felt different. Now, though he could not explain why, and he stayed just far enough away to remain unnoticed, leaning lightly against a metal railing that still held a trace of the day's warmth, his eyes scanning the movement near the entrance not with expectation, but with habit, the same quiet awareness that had guided him through countless days. And for a moment, everything seemed exactly as before. People passing, doors turning, the rhythm steady and indifferent, until it wasn't, because from the far end of the block a black sedan pulled up smoothly to the curb, its presence subtle but unmistakable in the way space seemed to adjust around it. And Marcus watched without meaning to, his attention caught by the small shift in energy. The way the driver stepped out with precise timing. The way the door opened not hurriedly, but with intention. And then the man from the day before stepped out, no longer seated near a pillar, no longer blending into the edges, but standing upright, composed, his coat now straight, his posture aligned with something that carried weight, authority, recognition, and Marcus blinked once, slowly, as the connection formed not in shock, but in quiet understanding. Pieces aligning in a way that felt almost unreal, and yet completely certain, and the distance between them remained. But the difference was no longer invisible. It was defined, clear, undeniable, and the man's gaze moved across the entrance before settling, just for a second, in Marcus's direction, not searching, not questioning, but recognizing. And that single moment held longer than expected, stretching across the space between them like something deliberate, something chosen. And Marcus straightened slightly without realizing it, his hand tightening around the edge of his sleeve as a faint tension settled into his chest. Not fear, not anticipation, just the weight of being seen in a way he was not used to. And around them the world continued without pause, unaware of the quiet shift taking place, unaware that something small had already begun to turn, and the man stepped forward then, moving past the entrance without stopping, his path not toward the building but toward the edge of the sidewalk where Marcus stood, each step measured, unhurried, the sound of his shoes soft against the pavement, and Marcus did not move away, did not step forward either. He simply stayed where he was, grounded in the same stillness he carried with him everywhere. And as the distance between them closed, the air seemed to settle, the noise fading just enough to make space for what was about to happen. And when the man finally stopped a few feet away, there was no immediate exchange of words, only a brief silence that held more weight than anything spoken. A pause that acknowledged not just the moment, but everything that had led to it. And in that quiet space, Marcus felt something unfamiliar shift beneath the surface of his routine, something that suggested this was no longer just another day, no longer just another passing interaction, but the beginning of something he could not yet name, something that had already begun before he even realized it. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt full, like something waiting to settle into place. And Marcus held his ground without forcing anything, his shoulders relaxed but steady, his eyes meeting the man's with a quiet openness that carried no expectation, while the man studied him with a different kind of attention now, not the distant observation from behind glass, not the detached curiosity of the day before, but something closer, something grounded in the reality of standing face to face. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying the same control Marcus had sensed even when he had been sitting on the ground. "You did not have to do that," he said, not as a question, not even as a challenge, but as a statement that lingered between them. And Marcus gave a small shrug, the motion simple, almost instinctive, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he answered without hesitation. "Neither did you." And the words landed softly, but they carried weight, enough to shift something subtle in the man's expression, not a smile, not quite, but a recognition that this was not a conversation he could direct the way he directed everything else in his world. And for a moment neither of them spoke again, the sounds of the city moving around them like a distant current, cars passing, footsteps echoing lightly across the pavement, a door opening somewhere behind them and closing again. And Marcus became aware of the faint chill creeping into his fingers, the kind that settled deeper the longer you stood still. But he did not move, because something in this moment felt important in a way he could not explain, something that asked him to stay present, to not rush it, and the man seemed to understand that as well, because instead of continuing immediately, he let the pause exist, let the space breathe, before shifting slightly, his gaze lowering just briefly to Marcus's worn shoes, then back up again, taking in the details without judgment, without dismissal, simply observing. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed, just enough to reveal something beneath the control. "Do you always give away what you need?" he asked, and Marcus exhaled quietly, a faint breath visible in the cooling air, his answer coming slower this time, not because he was unsure, but because the question reached deeper than it seemed. "I give what I can," he said, his voice steady. "Sometimes that is the same thing." And the honesty in it settled into the space between them, uncomplicated, unpolished, real, and the man nodded once. A small motion that carried more acknowledgment than agreement, as if he was placing that answer somewhere he would return to later, and for the first time since approaching, his posture shifted slightly, less guarded, less distant, as though the invisible boundary that usually separated him from moments like this had thinned, and the wind moved lightly through the street again, brushing against their coats, carrying with it the distant sound of a siren fading into the background, and Marcus felt the familiar instinct to step away, to let the moment end before it stretched too far. But something held him there, not pressure, not obligation, just a quiet sense that leaving now would close something that had only just begun to open, and the man seemed to reach the same conclusion at the same time, because he took a small step closer, not enough to invade space, just enough to signal intention, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a new clarity, something more direct, more deliberate. "My name is Daniel Whitmore," he said, the words simple but unmistakable, carrying a weight that did not need explanation in a city that recognized names like currency, and Marcus's eyes flickered just slightly, not with shock, but with understanding, the pieces finally settling into place fully, and he nodded once in return, his voice quiet but steady as he answered, "Marcus Reed." And in that exchange, brief as it was, something shifted completely, not in the world around them, not in the towering building behind them, but in the space between two men who had stood on opposite sides of everything the day before, and now stood in the same moment, seen, heard, and no longer invisible to each other. Daniel did not immediately follow his own introduction with explanation, and that absence of urgency carried more weight than any rushed justification could have, as if he understood that what mattered now was not who he was in the world above them, but what he had seen, what he had confirmed, and Marcus stood there with the same grounded stillness, his breath steady, his posture unchanged, waiting not for answers but for honesty. And Daniel finally shifted his gaze slightly toward the building behind them, its towering glass reflecting the dimming sky, before returning his attention to Marcus with a clarity that felt deliberate. "I have been watching that entrance for weeks," he said, his voice even, controlled, but no longer distant. "People come and go, hundreds every day, some in a hurry, some distracted, most indifferent." And he paused briefly, not for effect, but because the truth of what he was about to say required space, required precision. "Yesterday, you were the only one who stopped." And the words settled between them with a quiet finality, not exaggerated, not dramatized, just stated as fact, and Marcus absorbed it without visible reaction, though something subtle shifted behind his eyes, not pride, not surprise, but a deeper recognition of how rare that moment had been, not because of what he did, but because of how few others had. And Daniel continued, his tone unchanged but carrying more weight now. "I needed to know if it was chance, or if it was you." And Marcus tilted his head slightly, the movement small, thoughtful, as if considering the question behind the statement rather than the statement itself, and for a moment the noise of the street seemed to fall away again, replaced by the quiet gravity of what was unfolding, and Daniel took a slow breath, the kind that marked a transition, the kind that signaled a shift from observation to action. "So I looked into it," he said, not apologetically, not defensively, but plainly. "The cameras, the patterns, where you go, how you move through the city." And he paused again, watching for a reaction, but Marcus remained steady, not offended, not unsettled, simply listening. And that seemed to confirm something Daniel had already begun to understand, because when he spoke next, There was a trace of something different in his voice, something closer to respect. "It was not just yesterday," he said quietly. "It is how you live." And the statement carried more than information. It carried recognition, the kind that could not be bought or assumed, only earned through quiet consistency. And Marcus exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air, his gaze lowering for just a second before lifting again, not avoiding, not dismissing, just grounding himself in the reality of being seen in a way that went beyond surface. And Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his coat then, the movement smooth, unhurried, and for a brief second Marcus's eyes followed the motion, not with suspicion, but with simple awareness. And when Daniel's hand emerged, it held not money, not something easily dismissed, but a single, folded document, clean, precise, its edges sharp against the fading light. And he did not extend it immediately. He simply held it there, as if allowing the moment to catch up to itself. "You gave me something yesterday," he said, his voice steady. "Not because you expected anything, but because it was who you are." And now he did extend the document, not forcefully, not insistently, just offering it the same way Marcus had offered the food, without demand, without pressure. "This is not repayment," Daniel added, the words deliberate. "It is recognition." And Marcus looked at the paper, his hand remaining still at his side for a moment longer, as if weighing something deeper than the object itself, something that had nothing to do with value and everything to do with meaning. And the space between them held again, quiet, suspended, as the city continued to move around them, unaware that in that single exchange, something far greater than a simple gesture was about to be revealed. Marcus did not reach for the document right away, and that hesitation was not uncertainty. It was awareness, the kind that came from a life where nothing offered freely had ever been without consequence. And his eyes moved from the paper to Daniel's face, searching not for intent alone, but for truth, something steady enough to stand on. And Daniel did not rush him, did not fill the silence with explanation. He simply held the document there with the same calm patience Marcus had shown the day before. And that parallel did not go unnoticed, not by Marcus, not by the quiet weight of the moment itself. And slowly, Marcus lifted his hand, his fingers rough, slightly stiff from the cold, and took the paper, the edge brushing against his skin with a faint crisp sound that seemed louder than it should have been. And for a second he just held it, feeling the structure of it, the thickness, the intention behind something so precise, before unfolding it carefully, his movements deliberate, respectful, as if the act of opening it required more than curiosity. And when his eyes began to move across the page, the city around him seemed to blur, the motion, the sound, the passing footsteps all fading into something distant, replaced by the quiet intensity of understanding, line by line, word by word, the meaning settling deeper with each second. And his brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in disbelief that did not quite know how to express itself. And he read it again, slower this time, making sure the words did not shift, did not change into something else when looked at twice. And they did not. They remained exactly what they were, clear, undeniable, and far beyond anything he had expected to ever hold in his hands. And when he finally lifted his gaze, it was not with shock, it was with something quieter, something heavier, as if the weight of the paper had transferred into something inside him, something that had been steady for so long it did not know how to react to change. And Daniel met that look without stepping back, without softening the truth of what he had given. "It is already signed," he said calmly, his voice steady against the hum of the city returning slowly around them. "Transferred legally, effective immediately." And Marcus's grip on the document tightened just slightly, not enough to crease it, but enough to show that this moment was real, that it was not something passing, not something temporary. And his eyes shifted briefly toward the building behind them, the same structure he had stood outside countless times without being seen, without being acknowledged. And now the connection between that place and the paper in his hands felt almost impossible to reconcile. And Daniel continued, not to explain away the magnitude, but to ground it. "You helped build part of that structure," he said, his tone carrying a quiet certainty. "Years ago, before the accident, before everything changed." And Marcus's breath caught just slightly, the memory surfacing not as a clear image but as a feeling, the weight of tools in his hands, the height of steel beams under his boots, the sense of purpose that had once defined his days, and he looked back at Daniel, the distance between past and present narrowing in a way he had not expected, and Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the connection without needing to say more. You were part of it. Then, he added, now you are part of it again. And the words did not feel like a reward. They felt like a restoration, something returned rather than given, something recognized rather than granted, and Marcus stood there, the paper still open in his hands, the city moving around him, unchanged, unaware, while everything within that single moment had shifted completely, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a quiet certainty that settled deeper than anything loud ever could. Marcus did not speak right away, and that silence was not empty. It was full of something settling deep beneath the surface, something that did not need to be rushed into words, and slowly, he folded the document with the same care he had used to open it, his fingers tracing the edge once as if confirming it was real, before lowering his hand to his side. And when he looked up again, his eyes were steady, not overwhelmed, not distant, just grounded in a way that carried quiet strength, and Daniel watched him without interruption, without expectation, understanding that whatever came next did not belong to him. And for a brief moment the two men stood there as the city moved around them, cars passing, voices blending into the background, the light shifting toward evening as reflections stretched across the glass of the building behind them. And Marcus turned his head slightly, his gaze lifting toward the structure that had once been nothing more than a distant boundary, a place he passed but never entered, and now it stood the same as before, tall, silent, unchanged, and yet something about it felt different, not because the building had changed, but because the way it connected to him had, and he took a slow breath, the kind that carried memory with it, the echo of a time when his hands had shaped parts of that structure, when his days had been measured by progress, by purpose, by something that felt solid and lasting. And that feeling returned now, not all at once, not overwhelming, but steady, like something rediscovered rather than given. And without looking back at Daniel, he took a step forward, just one, toward the entrance, his shoes meeting the smooth surface of the walkway with a soft, almost unfamiliar sound. And this time no one stopped him, no one redirected him. The space that had once held invisible boundaries now opened without resistance, and he walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, each step deliberate, each movement grounded in the quiet understanding of what this moment meant. And as he reached the glass doors, they turned automatically, reflecting his image back at him for a brief second. A man who looked the same as he had the day before, same jacket, same worn shoes, same steady gaze. And yet there was something different in the way he stood, something that did not come from the document in his hand, but from the truth behind it. And he stepped inside, the shift in temperature immediate, the air warmer, quieter, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and clean surfaces, and for a moment he paused just past the threshold, not because he was unsure, but because he was present, fully aware of the transition that had taken place without noise, without spectacle, and behind him, Daniel remained where he was, watching not with ownership, not with control, but with a quiet acknowledgment that the moment no longer belonged to him. And Marcus continued forward then, deeper into the space, his reflection moving across the marble floor beneath him,